Tell me, do we have time for another number?
Oh, I think so, Jimmy. What tone do you have in mind?
Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of Drinking Matters. My name is Bryan, and with me, returning guest, I think at this point 3 or 4 different times into the show, Cris. Thank you very much, Cris, for joining me on this episode once again.
Of course. Hey, guys. How's it going?
Has it been 3 or 4 times that you've been on here?
It's been 3 times.
3 times counting today?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. At this point, it's kind of hard to keep track of the guests I've had. And you know what?
Time is mending together. It is. This is quarantine. It's really bad right now, but it's good. Things are kind of getting better. Not really, but...
We're opening up, which I guess is... I mean...
It's bad. It's bad.
Look, I'll say this. The world seems more alive now that things have opened up. We get a little more traffic. You know, people are taking their walks a little bit more. But it is bad because we have a rising number of COVID cases now. So, I mean, it depends on how you look at it. Glass is half full, glass is half empty. Definitely want the best to come out of the situation, though. Definitely. So, Cris, thank you very much for joining me on this episode, my man. How have you been, man? Just going to ask that question first and foremost.
Good.
Yeah?
The job search continues. Trying to keep a positive touch to things. I went to the gym the other day. I went super early, so there was nobody there. It's good. It's going good.
It's yeah. You know what? That's one thing I missed in quarantine. Just gyms not being open, and then finally now that there are, you know, even though you still have to take your precautions and whatnot, it just feels good to be out of the house. So it's good. I wish you the best of luck with your whole job search. We'll talk more about that later. But you know what, Cris? Again, I can't thank you enough for joining me, and I'm going to say this just because I called you in last minute, and I feel really bad because I didn't want to pull you away from anything super important, but I really, 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 really appreciate this. A topic came to mind earlier today that made me think of you, and it's why I reached out and why I wanted you on this episode. And it was the topic of censorship, specifically, you know, worldwide and here in the US. And we had kind of somewhat of a small discussion before we started recording, and you brought on some really good points. And I think that today for this episode, what I want to do is not so much of an argument, kind of seeing both sides, but more of a conversation between you and I, and seeing how I could become more educated from another person's perspective on what I see regarding censorship. I'll say this right now. As a normal person who consumes media through social media, through, you know, certain outlets out there, I'm trying to do my best in trying to keep myself informed as much as possible, but also watching out where I consume my news, you know? And something that has popped into my head constantly is, how do I know that I am receiving the best possible perspective on certain topics, either globally or nationally? Censorship has been a thing that, you know, has been mentioned multiple times, year in and year out. We see censorship in a lot of different things. We see it in, you know, our media that we consume. We see it in our cartoons, our TV, our video games, our books, our comics, everything like that. But it goes deeper than that. And by that, how else would you explain? How deeper does it go, Cris? Do you know? You care to explain a little bit more?
Well, it depends. I mean, here in the United States, we're not as bad as other countries.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it is getting to an alarming point here in the United States. From things such as, oh, this thing that happened in real life, it didn't really happen.
Mm-hmm.
So we're starting to see news articles do that. We've always seen here in the United States censorship over things that the general public would deem quote unquote too much for them to consume. Here in the United States, we're very protected for information and news that are kind of hard hitting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know Bryan. I don't know if you like watch like Univision
Oh, I
or
grew up on that stuff.
well, I mean, like
Yeah.
if you watch the comparison between that and like the daily news here,
Uh huh.
you'll see a lot more. Honestly, you'll see a lot more violence. They show clearly more violence on those
American
channels.
or Hispanic media
Hispanic media,
is
those have a lot um, more violence.
so. Can I
Uh,
comment on that real quick?
yeah, go ahead.
I'll give you my experience regarding that. That was actually a good thing to bring up. What the heck? I kind of put that in the back of my head. My experience with Hispanic media, I grew up on that. I grew up in a Hispanic household, so I spoke Spanish to both my mom and my dad growing up, and they would have um, Univision on constantly. And the one news channel that I would necessarily not like channel 13 or 34, the news, but you ever hear of a show called Primer Impacto?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that was when he said that. That's the show that immediately came to mind. And you're right. I feel like Hispanic media does exhibit more of traumatic events that happen worldwide. It's always more violent, from what I remember, or not even violence from people to people, but politically or naturally, natural disasters that happen in different parts of the world and stuff like that. That's what I remember regarding that. So, as I grew older, comparing that to English media, ABC 7, living here in California, Fox News, NBC News, MSNBC, CNN, all these different things. It's got a softer tone. You're right. It is definitely a softer tone.
Yeah.
Do you want to add more to that? I'm
I
sorry,
mean,
I took your
well,
spotlight
that
from that.
that was exactly what it was. I mean, you can't really say much about it. I mean, before, I mean, I feel like there might be a disconnect. I mean,
Hmm.
in the 60s and 70s, we saw Walter Cronkite televise the Vietnam War, where we would see explosions and people yelling and screaming and actual death on screen. Um, it's an interesting point to say that should children be watching it?
Hmm. Because it
Hmm.
was made publicly available in households, right?
Yes.
Okay. It is kind of strange. This was when? How long ago would you say this would have been?
Oh, Cronkite, that was late 60s, early 70s.
Late 60s, early 70s. Compare that to modern media, not as violent, more censored.
Yes.
Censored in a good way or in a bad way?
In a bad way, ultimately. Because I mean, sure, we need to like make sure like at least censor what our children's watch, like our children watch. But at the same time, we can't censor what we watch.
Uh huh.
It can get tiring. We can get fatigue, and I'm sure we've seen that over and over with the protests. We see that with COVID-19. It gets tiring, gets frustrating. So now you're seeing a lot less coverage on it,
Hmm.
even though there should nothing's really changed. The number continues to skyrocket. Black lives still matter and will keep going, and they should keep protesting. But we're seeing a disinterest because people are getting tired of it. You
Isn't
know?
that isn't that like just the agenda of media in general though, that whatever is more popular and can get more traction, it's just going to put itself out there?
And that statement is what killed journalism, the United States journalism. Yeah.
Huh. Have you ever had any experience with journalism at all, or is this just you talking as a consumer?
Well, I was going to be a journalism major. I took
Hmm.
a couple classes for journalism. Uh, I remember taking my intro to journalism class the same semester that Donald Trump would be elected.
Hmm.
Uh, oh man, it was rough. We were taught how to, I mean, take sources uh, with with a grain of salt, obviously.
Hmm.
Understanding that you do have certain groups that have certain agendas. Fox News, what is it? CN, USBC.
MSNBC and CNN.
There you go.
Hmm.
So those have certain agendas. There's most media's have certain agendas now. So you really do have to take things with a grain of salt, depending on what they're covering.
Hmm.
So I mean, it's just rough. And we were taught obviously to. I would say, oh man, most out of country coverage is a lot better than what we see here. I get most of my news from the Guardian, which is from the UK, and Al Jazeera, which is a Middle Eastern news source. And they cover a lot. Like they cover stuff from the United States a lot better than we do here.
I'm gonna pick your brain just a little bit before I ask you about pretty much how media essentially like they want to put out there what will get the most traction. I'm gonna pick your brain for just a second, if that's okay, regarding the outside media consumer or consuming that you just proposed or you just basically told me. Is there a reason as to why you as an individual feel much more comfortable consuming media from outside the US regarding US events?
Well, we're seeing a lot political biasm. I'm going to bring politics into every single one of your podcasts.
Hey, by all means, I think let's put it this way. Before we move on with this whole conversation, we're just two individuals having a conversation here. I think that we both respect each other. There's no need for us to essentially say like you're wrong and this is why and you're an idiot and start calling each other names. I think that we've both mutually agreed that you and I have immense respect for one another. We've joked about it. I think in the first episode that I brought you in, I joked about it and said like, oh, you know what? Our political views, yeah, they're total opposites, and I call you names and all this other stuff. You throw a jab here, you throw a jab there. I mean, it's all well and fun at some point, but I think when it comes in terms of having a serious discussion regarding stuff like this, there's mutual respect. So I welcome everything that you have to say. There's no reason for you to apologize or even say, oh, I'm going to bring politics into your podcast. Dude, by all means, go for it. This is why this podcast exists. This is why I wanted to have it. I want to have these conversations. I welcome them. Bring them. Come at me, Chris.
Okay, so that's going to get a little bit deep. All right.
Go for it. Go for it.
So we're seeing a lot of the quote unquote left media. It's a game to them. It's mostly just about views. They're bringing people from the right. They're bringing people from the left, but they're not really. They're just useless. It's just for them to argue. People watch reviews. They get a high five each other, and they move on. There's no real work being done in places like CNN. What was it? The CNSBC,
MSNBC.
That one, I don't watch it. I don't care enough to watch that one. And we're just seeing just a circus. We're just seeing a circus there. Then you have Fox News, which is equally a circus, but it's also an authoritarian. It's authoritarian, sucking up to the president news. It's not news anymore. It's just kind of saying they should just call it Trump is great news. That's literally what it is. It has no impartial meaning to any of its news now. Now it's, oh, Democrats are the worst. Oh, Democrats are doing this, this, and this. Oh, they're actually doing riots. Oh, all lives matter.
It's a platform to attack the opposition, essentially.
Yes.
Okay. Same thing could be said about the left media, correct? Is that kind of what you're saying? That the left is also...
No, I mean, they do it too, but over there on the right side, that's completely Trump news right there. That's, yeah. So it's I don't even watch TV news anymore. I really don't. I take everything online. I read articles. Apple News is pretty cool. I like how they organize your news to what you want to do. Want it, but yeah, no. TV media is pretty dead, or should be.
So you've exhibited two examples, pretty much saying that the left media. Okay, we'll say the left here. The left, in regards to media, is not as useful in gathering information because they want to just fulfill their agenda and make it. They want to make it more enticing, is what you're trying to say, right? To individuals.
I'll go farther than that. I'd say it's clickbait.
It's okay. And now with the right, you're essentially saying that it's more propaganda for the House at this point, for the president, essentially praising him and not necessarily putting in any sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Criticism towards the president right now. And anytime that it feels like it has some sort of platform, it's dedicated to attacking the left. Correct?
Exactly.
So
But
what makes?
I would have to argue that this is only right now.
Mm-hmm.
If Biden wins in November, I can't defend what CNN and USNBC,
MSNBC.
and
I'm just gonna put in where you
pronounce.
speak that word. I'm gonna put the robotic Google voice. MSNBC. Okay,
I
go on.
can't defend what they'll say because
Uh-huh.
they might turn around and do the exact same thing Fox News does.
I see.
That's how the political climate is, and that's how people are watching it. That's how they're reacting to it. So that's what they're going to be watching.
So you're saying that
Yep.
depending on the influence that the president has, depending on the influence that exists politically, that's where the media will kind of lean. So if you have a Democratic president, you're going to have left-leaning media essentially proceed in the direction of what the right media has been doing.
Yes.
Okay.
At least with the pattern that has
that has
been
existed
started since 2015.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I can't disagree with that because I do share similar takes on that. I don't think I would have put it as elegantly as you would have, but I mean that's exactly what I agree with. Now, why is it that so you've given me the examples as to why you don't feel comfortable with the media that exists here in the US. What entices you to then go into other countries' medias to learn about US politics and US events?
I think it's history, man. I really think it's we're watching a lot more of these groups, like other news. They took examples from our old media, which the United States had some of the best journalism throughout the 60s all the way up to the 80s. That was just phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And people have learned over there, and it's they understand the importance of it. Not to say that clickbait doesn't exist over there; it totally does. But when you have groups such as Hong Kong, and they have complete censorship, which that's what this episode's about. The censorship over there in Hong Kong kills people.
Mm-hmm.
Versus what's happening here, I think Americans we're really sheltered. I'm an American myself. Don't get me wrong. I think
you bleed red, white, and blue.
I am sheltered. I think you are sheltered. I think everyone is sheltered from what a country should really do in terms of political escalation, in terms of what a revolution is.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's kind of scary that that us our birth was just a straight up revolution, that we're just turning around and sitting and taking what our government is doing to us now.
Mm-hmm.
Where hundreds of people are dying. We've had more people die from coronavirus than World War I killed Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So and we're reopening our every state. We're reopening everything, even though cases are generally not decreasing. They're increasing pretty substantially. It's just dangerous. I think the level of danger is a lot more well aware in other countries, even countries like France. France is the OG of revolutions as well. But they've kept at it.
Mm-hmm.
They've kept at it. And,
Let me.
I think. Go ahead.
Let me ask you this, Chris. Okay, I'm gonna put my 2 cents into this. I was always taught since high school, essentially, that no matter what article or what source you get your media or news from, there's always going to be bias. Any person that writes anything regarding a subject will always have some sort of bias. It's, from what I understood, impossible to not write something and not have some sort of bias towards that subject. And I understand where you're coming from with this whole thing, saying that American media always has an agenda to fulfill. If it's not the left, it's also, if it's not the right, there's always something that exists that they want to try to accomplish. Wouldn't you say that media from other countries regarding U.S. politics and events also have some sort of bias that you yourself should be afraid of?
Of course, but I mean, I feel like that's like a bias of like, there's a bully in our classroom, everyone hates him, and everyone else knows they hate him, but to their face we're really nice to him. That's the U.S. policy with the rest of the world. We're the
Okay.
big bully.
Yeah. So
Um,
the reason I ask is this, and like again, this is in no ways to discourage you or essentially attack your opinion. It's more of like a thought that just comes to my head. Let's say that a media from Britain comes out and starts discussing healthcare in the United States, right?
yes.
They continuously attack, and this is just hypothetical. This is or theoretical. Excuse me. This is just theoretical. This is not. No, I'm not pulling out any sources or anything. This is all theoretical. Britain comes out and starts like just full on attacking U.S. healthcare, full on attacking. Um, they're using different things. They're using their facts, they're using their research, and all this other stuff. When you look at Britain and pretty much their form of healthcare, at least from my eyes, it's not one of the best systems that's out there. So when I look at something like that coming from there, having a conversation about our healthcare and then somewhat praising their own methods, I would look at it with some sort of skepticism, thinking what gives them the right to essentially attack our healthcare services when their services aren't also the best. They may be somewhat better than ours, but they're not the best, and they're not like the leading healthcare. They're not leading in healthcare in the world, essentially. So why should I trust them to essentially criticize our own methods and our own system? You know what I'm saying?
Okay. Well, there is a difference between an editorial, which anyone can say their piece, and an actual like a news article that is there to inform.
Uh huh.
An editorial is more a political view or just a view in general.
Hmm.
Journalism, at its basis, has a structure of showing both sides of the story. You have a house that burned down. Uh, you have a family said this family did it. The same family says the other family did it. The news article, the news source has an obligation to talk to both families, hear both sides of the story, and have the reader choose the side for like they have information. That's what media at its base is supposed to say. It's information. This is what's happening on this side. This is what's happening on this side. What are your thoughts on it?
Uh huh.
That's it. Like you should be able to create your own thoughts from what the news is giving you.
I
The
think
news should not be giving you your own thoughts. You
I
should have your own
yeah.
thoughts already.
I think that you and I had this conversation before on an earlier episode. I think it was what was the first episode I had you on? Because last time I had you on, we talked about health literacy essentially, and how I think that was that one, wasn't it?
It might have been.
Where we were discussing how pretty much individuals need to not just gather the information and believe it as is, that they need to develop their own takes on it and
Yes.
kind of, yeah, I think we discussed this earlier. And I didn't disagree with it. I think you're 100% correct on that. I think what I'm trying to get at is, different parts of the world have different forms of censorship. I want to bring it back into something that you mentioned, because I mean, like you said, it's the topic of this podcast. Is the idea of censorship? When you look at something like China, essentially, right? China for I would say months before, was it before Corona, or was it during the tensions between China and Hong Kong? I mean, they're still existent and they're still pretty high up there. But when media was here in the U.S. was covering it in bulk, was this before or after or during?
All three. It's still
It's
happening
all
right
three.
now.
I felt like for some reason, I don't know if this is me just thinking incorrectly, but I always felt that before Corona, before the big impact, before the big pandemic, excuse me, that was the topic that U.S. media was focused on 100%. Was China going to do a hostile takeover of Hong Kong? The whole protest things, everything going on. Granted, the tensions are still high up there. Things are still not looking well and all these sorts of things. But is it just me, or is media here covering it less than what they used to?
Oh, it's a lot less for sure. Well,
It,
I mean, I don't know. It's a lot less, but there's also a lot more going on. since since then.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, of course. A lot more pressing issues here nationally than internationally. But what I'm trying to get at is essentially the censorship that exists out there compared to here. You know, when we think of censorship, a lot of people here fear it. You fear censorship. I mean, am I wrong in saying that?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah, I fear censorship. I don't ever want to live in a country that forbids me from saying certain things. I mean, granted, if censorship existed here in the U.S. as badly as it did elsewhere, we wouldn't be having this conversation here. I wouldn't be able to have a podcast where we discuss these topics. Essentially, anything regarding something that has a negative impact on something else could get immediately shut down. Um,
For, for example, I would not be able to say what is it? Xi Jinping? I forgot his name. Fuck. What's the president's? I'm gonna look that up real quick. Give me
go
one
go
second.
look it up. Go look it up. That's the clicking you heard on my clip on my keyboard. I was looking some stuff up as well. This is as we go, a
Xi
flow.
Jinping. We would not be able to say that he looks like Winnie the Pooh because people get arrested and killed for
Why
saying
didn't
that.
you just say
But he
Winnie the
looks
Pooh?
like Winnie the Pooh. So we're gonna call him Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah,
See, we wouldn't be able to say that. We wouldn't be able to say that.
it's
Um,
it's kind of scary. Like we joke about that. I mean, look, again, I'm going to make this 100% clear. These tensions are real. We're not going to say that this isn't something that should be taken lightly. And out of respect for those that are protesting and still fighting for their freedoms out there, it's something that we have to have massive respect for. We have to tread lightly. With that said, the whole Winnie the Pooh thing with the president of China, right? You see that out there. There's a lot of people that have essentially mocked the president of China using a Disney character. And what does China do?
they arrest him.
They
as a
censor
consequence.
they freaking
Yeah.
censor the crap out of that. Did you hear about what China was doing with players on Animal Crossing?
No. What
Oh,
happened?
you didn't. This is a fun one. So, oh my God, I feel like I'm. It's okay. So essentially, what was going on was I don't want to say that it was strictly just Hong Kong protesters. I don't want to cite something that is incorrect. All I would say is that there were certain people hosting protests in Animal Crossing villages. Okay.
Nice.
And in these protests, essentially, they would have the image of the president of China essentially laid on the floor, and the villagers would then grab their bug nets and keep hitting the president of China over and over again. And there would be patterns, essentially. If you're not familiar, if any listeners are not familiar with Animal Crossing, you are allowed to have templates of designs, pretty much. You can make different patterns and different designs. If you look them up, some of the artwork for that game is fantastic. But what it allowed these protesters to do, essentially, is to put out there censored words and phrases that China was just not going to have anything. It wasn't going to have it out there, and essentially doing the same thing, hitting it with a bug net, and also putting it on the floor and erasing it, essentially erasing the face of the president of China. What China ended up doing in response is essentially saying, yeah, Animal Crossing can no longer be here. We're actually going to be canceling you guys from playing with anybody outside of China. If we see any form of disrespect towards the president, you guys are done. We're arresting you, pretty much. That's the little story that happened with Animal Crossing. I can't believe you didn't hear about that, Chris.
Can someone tell that guy that it's just a game?
You can't.
Like,
You can't. And that's the thing. I mean, look, I'm going to say that right now America has had it's not even a truckload at this point. It's the asteroid the size of what killed the dinosaurs. That's how big our problems have amassed to. But at least here we have that freedom to essentially say certain things and distribute the information. We can fight it, because I've seen it where it's more, we try to say why isn't this being written about? Why isn't this being showcased? And then certain sites will essentially try to take it down because it's labeled as quote unquote fake news or whatnot, right? But at least here we have that freedom to essentially distribute that information. Like I said, you and I have the freedom to essentially have this conversation, discuss the topic of censorship. Over there in China, you can't even call the president of China Winnie the Pooh without getting arrested. You can't play your games. Everything that they go through, essentially, everything, any form of entertainment needs to go through a council. I think even South Park had an episode regarding that. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, but that doesn't sound. That definitely sounds like that.
Yeah, they essentially joked about it and said that in order for, I think it was like Stan or something, to make a movie, it needed to be okayed by some sort of Chinese branch or something like that. So it's ridiculous how much censorship exists out there. I mean, you got anything to say regarding that?
Um, yeah, it's sad. People aren't able to express themselves. From what you said, if this was taking place in China, I'd probably be dead already.
Well, this wouldn't
Which
exist, Chris. We wouldn't even
it's
be able.
terrifying.
The moment that you and I have made a video call, we would have been shut down.
Yeah.
Like 5 seconds in, but it exists, and I feel like we need to essentially be more aware of that. Would you say, and I think that this is kind of a self-explanatory question, that the censorship of China has essentially affected how we report news here?
Yes.
And to
Well,
what extent?
in what way? I want to hear your side of the story first.
Okay. So when I think of how journalists try to report certain things, they need to have as much information as possible, right?
Yeah.
So when you have a country like China essentially saying, yeah, you want to talk about these events? Sure. Just don't mention this. Don't mention that. Definitely don't mention this. And that other thing that you were talking about, it never happened. So how are people here, or even for you, someone in, where is it that you get your media from again?
Al Jazeera, Guardian,
We'll use the Guardian.
CNN.
The Guardian is located where?
Guardian is a UK based news source.
Okay, so how is a journalist from um, the US or the UK supposed to report on these things accurately to give us the correct information and make our own takes on what's going on out there so as to not uneducate ourselves about the issues that have been going around out there?
Well, they actually have correspondents all around the world, so there's definitely a group. There's definitely Guardian definitely has presence here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like a whole building, but I mean they have the individuals here that are able to cover news happening here 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so you feel like that censorship that exists out there, like, okay, because again, you said correspondents here in the US that are able to report to the UK base and then publish something out there regarding news here. What I'm saying is censorship in China, does it affect how we report things here? And does it make us less educated and unable to make our own takes on what's going on out there? Am I
No.
making any sense at
I
all,
mean,
Chris?
I get what you mean,
Uh-huh.
but we do have a lot of our journalists are pretty. They take a lot more risks. I mean, I'm not saying other journalists don't take risks. A lot of journalists in South America that could vouch for that for
Mhm.
sure. I think journalism has a risk factor, and I mean, generally we are not like that. We like to get as much news as possible. Biasm, that's another story, but we like to get as much news out there as possible. China does affect our journalism to a certain extent, but we usually have enough journalism, not enough journalists over there corresponding back to us that risk their lives just to give us our news.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, yeah, it affects us, but I mean, it affects more the individuals who are granting us that information.
Can I ask you what your take on, or can I ask you what your take is regarding the COVID crisis in China? Essentially, how do you feel about the criticism that China essentially, how can I put this to make sense of it? How do you feel about critics essentially saying that China did not report its numbers correctly regarding the COVID pandemic. Do you feel like
Well,
that is an accurate thing to
yes,
essentially say,
yes.
especially with them censoring a lot of the stuff that's been going on?
Well, the censorship was the problem. Um, China wanted to save face, and they refused to allow the rest of the world that they messed up. And by covering up that mess up, they messed up even larger, to the point where COVID-19 spread all over China and up to our reality now.
So,
So
uh-huh.
I wouldn't say China's like they're solely responsible. Obviously, our administration is completely responsible for what's happening here in the United States.
Uh-huh.
But their initial response, yeah, it's China's fault.
So the reason I asked that is because we were saying beforehand that China censors pretty much anything that makes it look bad, right? And I remember that's the one thing that I was looking into. I like health. I want to learn as much as possible, especially since that was my undergrad, essentially. So when looking at the numbers and the early stages of the pandemic, every other country was rising in numbers. All of a sudden, in some form, China's numbers plateaued, while the rest of the world essentially kept climbing up and up and up and up and up. But the plateau never seemed to make any sense. And then the numbers started to decrease. And then all of a sudden, China came out and started reporting, hey, you know what? Wuhan, the source of basically ground zero for the pandemic, is now cleared of COVID. And we're slowly getting rid of it in our area. I don't understand why the rest of the world is still suffering. We are essentially leading in, the cures and stuff like that. Now, take that into consideration and think about that censorship affecting how it's reported here or in the UK for The Guardian. How are people supposed to essentially rely that these people that are reporting on this sort of stuff are getting the correct information? Because there's still speculation that exists. So how do those speculations come out and about? You know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you got anything to say regarding that? Like, I want to know your take on that.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. I think I'm finally clicking.
Okay. after 5 minutes of discussing the same thing.
Well, I do like to say that the truth always comes out eventually.
Uh-huh.
And China definitely has a large portion of control over its media and what is said to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, even a month later, 2 months later, we will get the truth, no matter how far away it was. It'll
How diluted or covered up it was, essentially.
Yes, it always comes back. It always comes back to us. Just like how we know that happened, it had to come up somehow. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Now, Chris, the last part of this podcast, it's going to be, like I said, a short one. So I do want to ask this: do you think that Americans should fear some form of censorship in the future that's anywhere close to what, let's say, China is facing?
That's a scary question.
It is a scary question.
I think we need to continue to fight.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to continue to vote. I think we need to continue to be aware of what's going on, because we very well could end up to a similar fate as Hong Kong is. We're seeing here in the United States. This happened, I think, last week when Donald Trump, our president, he decided to take a stroll down to the church.
It was a historic church by the White House, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a bunch of Black Lives Matter protesters in front, and he decided to gas them. Even though they were protesting peacefully, their right is to protest, especially peacefully. They got gassed and forced to move away just because he wanted to take a photo in front of the church.
Mm-hmm.
News outlets reported this. Donald Trump had tear gas and used it against the protesters that were peacefully protesting in front of the church. The White House administration sent a retraction telling all news media articles saying, we didn't use tear gas. We only used gas, and it was posted to most every single article that was released saying that.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason we know this is because the Guardian also got a retraction from the White House, and they decided to write about that instead of actually retracting it.
Mm-hmm.
This is real. This is 2020, and our
Yeah,
administration
our president.
is trying to control what we are reading. This is real. Um, Another topic: Hong Kong fighting viciously against the new national security law that Beijing is trying to impose upon them.
Mm-hmm.
This allows them to let me pull this up really quick. It basically allows China to say, oh, it gives them a very wide umbrella to say, oh, this is what you're doing. Oh, that's terrorism. We're gonna put you in jail. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
you're doing this. This is unsafe. This is a national security issue. We're gonna throw you in jail. Basically, giving China full reign to impose military threat against all of Hong Kong. It's scary. This is where we're at right now.
It's a scary thing to think about. It's a very scary thing to even consider that would come here in the U.S. We have, the right to essentially speak and say what we need to say, and question it. In response to essentially what you were saying, and I mean, feel free to add on to this. I think this goes back to the episode where I had you before regarding health literacy. Um, if anything, you're 100% correct. I think that people do need to get out there and vote, not just, say what they believe in, but show what they believe in. That's why you have people out there protesting. That's why you have people out there standing up for what they believe in. And that should carry forth, especially when it comes to, doing something about it with voting and stuff like that. In regards to media and news and consuming it, when you told me that you consume media outside of the US, and then you spoke about how you see US media and why you really don't pay any attention to it, most people can say that that's very one-sided of you. The way I like to see it is that you are informed because you're able to compare two sides and essentially make your decision from there. And I kind of have the feeling that a lot of individuals don't have that aspect. They essentially just sit down and consume whatever's in front of them and whatever's easiest and let the media speak for them. In terms of censorship, it's tough because I think that even now living here, we still have some sort of censorship. Wouldn't you agree?
yes.
Yeah, it's difficult because I think that we need to be more aware of what exactly is being censored, and not necessarily freak out about it, but do our job and educate others about things that are being censored, so as to not let other people fall victim to that. Do you want to add anything, Chris, to that?
I mean, it's just I'm scared.
Uh huh.
For sure. I don't want to scare other people into. Oh, he's scared. I should be scared.
No,
I
no,
think
no,
you should
no.
be aware. I think it's not. I'm afraid because what I'm seeing right now is it's a bad time in history. Um,
Fear only appears when you aren't necessarily aware of what's going on. Education is essentially the best tool in times like this.
yes.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
yeah.
it's no. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go, go, go. That's all I needed to say was education is the best tool you can have.
It's like I said, like we were saying, just be aware, understand what's happening, vote if you can. If you are able to vote, you have to be there. You have to be in front of the voting polls and voting over mail
Plain
and
and simple,
yeah.
essentially. Do you want to add anything before we close out this podcast, Chris?
No, that should about do
That should
it.
about do it. All right, Chris. So, once again, thank you very, very much for being on this episode with me today. I know it's a short one. Like I said, I didn't mean to drag you on so late, but I do appreciate you being on this episode. One other thing I do want to add, Chris, I do want to have you on an episode of this podcast where it's not so serious, because I feel like every time I do bring you on, it's always a serious topic. And
Yeah,
I do feel bad because, we don't talk seriously all the time. I think people need to know that you and I essentially are, really good friends and have other topics of conversation outside, scary things and serious things and politics and our perspectives of stuff. So what I do want to do, and I don't want to promise this to you or to any of our listeners early on, but I will say it will happen, is I do want to have an episode with you and Manny and just have, fun time conversations and just have a chill, you know, discussion with drinks in hand. And then hopefully, we can actually hang out outside of our own homes and not be stuck behind a computer screen talking to one another.
yeah, that'd be nice.
Yeah. So
People
whenever
need to know that I have a personality.
you
Okay?
do have a
I
person,
got
look,
jokes.
your
I've got
personality,
jokes.
your personality right now, Chris, is an intellectual. I will do my duty as your friend to bring you on an episode and give you the other 2/3 of your personality.
I'm not just a fucking nerd.
Yeah, no, who said you were? I'm a
I
nerd.
am. I'm saying it.
Chris, I love you, man. You know I do. But I will bring you on the next time with Manny, and we're going to have a fun time podcast, okay?
Sounds good.
All right, Chris, do you have anything to plug in?
No, just my usual Instagram. That should be written down.
In the
Bottom
description.
below, it's Chris the Titan _. On the bottom below, I'll also have Bryan put down the Guardian website, Al Jazeera's website, just so you guys can check it out.
I love how you
pretty
put
good
that
stuff
in
from
there.
them.
Like you just put that in there. He's like, yeah, I'm going to have Bryan do that. I'm the one who's dictating his descriptions now. I make sure what's on there. I'll put it on there, Chris.
This podcast is 2 seconds away from being mine. Keep it up.
This a hostile takeover of my podcast, Chris. You're welcome here anytime, dude. You're welcome to come in. And that's another thing that you wanted to discuss something. Can you give our listeners? I think you mentioned it. I hope you remember it because you said something that I was like, yeah, I definitely want to talk or I want to talk about this. You want to give them? Do you remember what it was?
Dude, I have no, I don't. What are you talking about? I don't really.
I think the last time when we ended the last episode, you said that you wanted to talk about art and how it's used to influence education amongst kids or something like that.
Yeah, why are we bringing this up now?
Because it's a teaser for the next episode, so that when it's another episode of Drinking Matters and they see special guest Chris, they'll know what we're going to talk about, and it's not going to be super serious like censorship.
The next one is going to be co-host, not special guest. All right.
Oh my God,
yeah.
Chris. I love you, man. All right, guys. So that concludes this episode of Drinking Matters. I know that Chris, he wasn't drinking anything beforehand. I was drinking a little bit of whiskey just to keep the theme of the podcast going. I don't know. Do you have a drink with you, Chris?
Just the plain old water.
You know what? Cheers to that, my friend. If you still have liquid in there, because we can't cheers on an empty cup. Cheers. Thank you very much for being on this episode of Drinking Matters. I will go ahead and put his socials in the description down below, as well as the link to the Guardian and the Al Jazeera. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Al Jazeera?
Yeah.
Al Jazeera website down below. So if you guys are interested in checking out what Chris reads to get informed, you can go ahead and do so. Links to my socials will be down in the description below. That includes YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, if I haven't mentioned that. Feel free to follow me there if you guys would like. This podcast is streaming on YouTube. I do upload there Fridays at 12. And you can also listen to the podcast on Spotify, same time as always, Fridays at 12. So you have both platforms of choice. Give me a follow over there. Give me a sub on YouTube. With that said, Chris, once again, cheers to you, my friend. Thank you for being on this episode of Drinking Matters. And listeners, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Drinking Matters. My name is Bryan. This was Chris. We'll see you all in the next one. Take care.
See you guys.